The sun had barely clawed its way through the thick, humid haze over the prawn farms south of Mackay that morning in early June 2018. A salty wind blew in from the Coral Sea, mingling with the rich, earthy smell of mangrove mud. The narrow track leading to the local police station was deserted, save for the rhythmic clinking of a chain on an old delivery bike. From the haze, two figures emerged, walking with a hurried, unnatural gait. Bruce Miller, a man well into his 60s whose whipcord body was a testament to a life of hard labor, strode forward, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles. Beside him, his daughter-in-law, Chloe, seemed to float, her face pale and her eyes puffy and swollen. They pushed through the station's creaking fly-screen door just as the clock on the wall struck 8. A couple of uniformed officers, just starting their day, looked up, startled by their abrupt arrival. Bruce spoke first, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Our boy's gone. Hasn't been home in 2 days." He explained that he'd had a blue with his son, Liam, about how to run the farm. Liam, full of bright ideas from his TAFE course, wanted to switch to a modern biofloc system. Bruce saw it as a waste of good money, a slap in the face to the methods that had built his small empire from mud and sweat. After the row, Bruce said, Liam had packed a bag, declaring he was off to Brisbane to make it on his own. Chloe just stood there, head bowed, her hands twisting the hem of her simple cotton dress. When she finally spoke, her voice was a trembling whisper, barely audible over the hum of the old air conditioner. She claimed she'd received a brief, crackly phone call from Liam. He'd told her he was in the city, looking for work, and not to worry. But after that, his phone went straight to voicemail. At the memory, her composure shattered. A sob tore from her throat, and her shoulders began to shake, a portrait of a heartbroken wife consumed by grief. The constable on duty took down the report, classifying it as an adult who had voluntarily left home. There were no signs of foul play. He advised them to simply wait a few more days, that young blokes often needed to blow off steam. But when the file landed on a desk at the Mackay District Headquarters, it found its way to Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley. Jack was a veteran of more than 20 years on the force. His hair was turning a distinguished silver at the temples, his gaze was sharp enough to cut through steel, and his most defining professional trait was a deep-seated mistrust of anything that seemed too neat. Jack read the report twice, his eyes lingering on two particular details. First, if Liam was so furious that he'd stormed off to prove a point, why would he immediately call his wife to reassure her? A young man trying to assert his independence would more likely want to maintain a defiant silence, not check in like a schoolboy. Second, there was the 2-day gap before they filed the report. If the family was truly frantic with worry, why wait 48 hours? Jack's gut, honed by years of seeing the worst of human nature, told him that a delay like that often meant one thing: someone needed time to get their story straight. That afternoon, Jack convened a small meeting with his investigation team. He pointed to a projector screen displaying Liam's phone records. The data, obtained from the telco, was unequivocal. There had been no incoming call to Chloe's number at the time she'd specified. Every call, every text, was logged. There was nothing. Jack let the silence hang in the air before stating the obvious, his voice calm and even. "So, we're starting with a lie." The detectives in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The case had just taken a dark turn. The next morning, Jack decided to drive down to the Miller farm himself. It was a sprawling property, nearly 50 hectares carved out of the coastal wetlands, with more than 20 massive ponds shimmering under the oppressive Queensland sun. The main homestead, a classic high-set Queenslander, stood in the centre of the property, surrounded by coconut palms and a winding dirt driveway. As Jack's unmarked Commodore pulled up, a few farmhands scattering prawn feed stopped and stared, their curiosity piqued by the official-looking vehicle. Jack stepped inside the house, and an immediate, unsettling feeling washed over him. It wasn't messy. On the contrary, it was immaculate. The floorboards gleamed, the dining table was set for a meal that would never be eaten, and Liam's bedroom was so tidy it looked like a display home. His wardrobe was full of neatly folded clothes, his boots were lined up perfectly by the door. There was no sign of a hasty departure. In an ashtray by the bed, a single cigarette but sat, smoked only halfway down. Jack turned to Chloe, who hovered nervously in the doorway. "Did you tidy up in here after Liam left?" he asked, his tone casual. Chloe shook her head quickly, a little too quickly. "No, I couldn't bring myself to touch anything. I've been waiting for him to come back." The answer was plausible, even touching, to the untrained ear. But to a seasoned detective like Jack Riley, it sounded rehearsed. It was too perfect. After inspecting the house, the team moved out towards the ponds. Jack questioned several of the workers, and strangely, their stories were identical, almost word for word. Liam got into a stoush with his old man and took off for the city. Nothing weird about it. Jack's suspicion deepened. He knew country folk. Their stories were usually honest, but messy, full of conflicting details and personal opinions. When everyone sang from the same hymn sheet, it meant the choir director had been conducting rehearsals. Among the workers was an old-timer named Finn. His hair was white as seafoam, his skin baked a deep, leathery brown by decades under the Queensland sun. He'd worked on this farm for more than 20 years. When Jack took him aside, away from the others, Finn stared at the ground for a long time, kicking at a loose clump of dirt with his worn-out boot. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low murmur. "Something's not right with Pond 5. The last few nights, the prawns have been coming to the surface, gasping. The water, it stinks. Not the usual smell." He paused, then added, "Saw Chloe, Mrs. Miller, standing by the edge of it the other night. Middle of the night. Just standing there, staring." The old man's words landed like a stone in a still pool. Jack stood in silence for a moment, his gaze drifting towards the pond in question. It shimmered peacefully under the afternoon sun, its surface reflecting the vast, blue sky. It looked serene, idyllic even. But his instincts screamed that something terrible was hidden beneath the mud. He pulled out a handkerchief, wiped the sweat from his brow, and gave a quiet order to his junior officer. "Pond 5 is off limits. Nobody goes near it. Stop all feeding. And get a covert camera set up, facing the water." That night, the camera captured exactly what he'd expected. In the ghostly green glow of the night vision lens, Chloe appeared. She stood at the edge of the pond for a long time, just staring into the black water. Her expression was no longer one of sadness. It was pure, unadulterated anxiety. Her eyes, glinting in the dark, darted around as if she knew the secret festering at the bottom of the pond was about to be exposed. Jack watched the footage over and over, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. He let out a long, slow breath. The following morning, an emergency meeting was called. A difficult decision had to be made. Pond 5 had to be drained. It was a massive risk. It would cost a fortune, take days, and if they found nothing, the department would face ridicule and a potential lawsuit. But Jack was certain. The truth was waiting down there. He looked at his team, his expression grim. "If we don't act now," he said, "whatever evidence is in that pond will be lost for good, eaten away by the mud and the life within it." There were no objections. Everyone in the room knew he was right. On the 6th of June, at 5 a.m., the deafening roar of a large industrial pump shattered the dawn quiet of the countryside. Water began to recede, slowly revealing the thick, black sludge beneath. The entire investigation team stood at the edge, their hearts pounding in a tense, collective rhythm. Time seemed to crawl. Then, at 3 p.m., a technician shouted, his voice cracking with alarm. He'd found something suspicious at the bottom. Everyone rushed to the edge of the pond. A putrid, metallic smell filled the air, so overpowering that some officers gagged. From the mud, a dark shape began to emerge, tangled with a heavy rock. The team froze, a few turning away, trying not to be sick. It was a human body. It was bound with rope, its face disfigured beyond recognition. But in the pocket of the mudded jeans, a wedding ring was found, engraved with the initials L and C. There was no longer any doubt. It was Liam, Bruce Miller's only son, Chloe's husband. Standing at the edge of the now empty pond, Jack Riley remained perfectly still. He stared at the body being carefully lifted onto a tarp. His heart felt like a lead weight in his chest, but his conviction had been proven right. This wasn't a missing person case. This was a calculated, cold-blooded murder. And with that discovery, the investigation had entered a brutal new chapter. The news of Liam's body being pulled from Pond 5 spread through the small coastal community like a summer bushfire. The salty air, usually a comfort, now seemed to carry the stench of death and betrayal to every corner of the town. Locals gathered along the dirt track leading to the farm, their cars parked haphazardly on the verges. Some covered their mouths in horror, others whispered in shocked, hushed tones. No one could believe that the tranquil prawn ponds, the lifeblood of the Miller family, had been hiding such a dark and gruesome secret. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream when she was asked to identify the clothes and the ring on the corpse's finger. She collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing with sobs that echoed across the property. A few local women, who had come to offer support, fought back tears of sympathy. But Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley remained impassive, his sharp eyes watching her every move. He'd seen enough performances in his career to know that grief could be a mask as easily as it could be an honest emotion. Bruce Miller, meanwhile, stood with a chilling stoicism. He glanced at his son's remains for only a moment before speaking, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Yeah, that's Liam." There were no cries of anguish, no tears. That single, cold reaction solidified Jack's certainty that the old man was hiding something monstrous. The forensic team swarmed the area, taping it off and beginning their meticulous work. They collected samples of the sludge, measured the faint tire tracks near the pond's edge, and photographed everything. On the western side, the imprint of a wheelbarrow, leading from the direction of a large storage shed to the water, was clearly visible. Alongside it were two sets of footprints, one large and deep, the other smaller, lighter. Every detail was carefully documented. Jack stood looking at the marks in the mud, a heavy weight pressing on his shoulders. Each track, each imprint, was a sentence in a story left behind by the killers, and that story was beginning to speak. Later that afternoon, the team gathered back at the station. The small briefing room was cluttered with maps of the farm, crime scene photos, and preliminary reports. Jack began, his tone firm and direct. Liam wasn't drowned. The ME's initial assessment suggests he was struck from behind with a heavy, blunt object. He was likely unconscious or dead before he ever hit the water. This was a planned execution. A heavy silence fell over the room. He continued, "The tracks show two perpetrators. One big, one small. My gut tells me it's an inside job. Only family would have had unrestricted access to the shed and the ponds in the dead of night." The names Bruce and Chloe hung unspoken in the stale air. That night, Jack sat alone on the veranda of the station, looking out at the starless Mackay sky. The chirping of crickets and the ever-present smell of the sea drifted in through the open window. He thought back on the hundreds of cases he'd worked, the senseless violence, the tragic losses. But this one felt different, heavier. Taking a life was brutal, but for a father to kill his own son, for a wife to betray her husband, that was a level of treachery his mind struggled to comprehend. Back at the Miller farm, the atmosphere had turned toxic. The farmhands, usually jovial and loud, now spoke in hushed whispers, afraid to make eye contact. Old man Finn, the one who had first given Jack the lead, kept to himself in a corner of the workshop, his heart thumping with the fear that his secret conversation with the detective might be discovered. Chloe had locked herself in her room, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. Her sobs could be heard through the thin walls at night, but whether they were tears of loss or tears of fear was impossible to know. Bruce, however, remained a pillar of cold resolve. He ordered the workers to continue feeding the other ponds, acting as if nothing had happened. He still spoke with an air of authority, still greeted the few brave visitors with a veneer of politeness, but his aura had changed. A thick wall of ice had formed between him and the rest of the world. Over the next few days, the police began re-interviewing everyone. The workers were brought in one by one. This time, their stories were no longer perfectly aligned. A young bloke named Kev admitted he'd seen Bruce and Chloe having an intense, hushed conversation by the main gate late on the night Liam disappeared. Another worker, Damo, mentioned hearing a loud thud from the direction of the shed around midnight. These small, fragmented pieces of information were slowly building a damning picture. Jack devised a new strategy. He knew a direct accusation would be met with denial. He had to be patient, to break their alliance, to make them turn on each other. To do that, he would use a psychological approach. Chloe would be placed in a separate interrogation room with a female officer, creating a sense of safety. Bruce, on the other hand, would be handled in a way designed to test his legendary temper and control. But before that, Jack returned to the scene of the crime one last time. He stood at the edge of the empty, sun-baked mud pit that was once Pond 5. The police tape fluttered in the afternoon breeze that rustled the leaves of the surrounding gum trees. He bent down, scraping the dried mud with the toe of his boot. He murmured to himself, "Rest easy, Liam. We are going to find the truth, no matter who it hurts." That night at the farm, Chloe lay awake. The bedroom was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness, the memory of that terrible night playing on a torturous loop in her mind. In the next room, Bruce sat with a bottle of Bundaberg rum, his face a hard, unreadable mask. The two people, who had once been united in their horrific secret, were now beginning to view each other with suspicion and fear. Outside the farm gates, a hidden police camera continued to watch their every move. Jack had deliberately left them to stew, knowing that fear was the most effective key for unlocking secrets. He was right. The next day, Chloe began to crumble. Her voice was softer, her eyes were permanently red-rimmed, and her body trembled uncontrollably when she was asked to come down to the station. Jack looked at her, sensing that a confession was just a matter of time. What had begun as a simple missing persons report had now spiraled into a town-defining tragedy. The quiet community was no longer quiet. Everyone whispered. How could a father be so cruel to his own flesh and blood? How could a wife betray the man who trusted her? Jack knew this was only the beginning. There were more layers of lies to peel back, and the coming night would determine whether the first mask would finally fall. After the discovery of Liam's body, Jack felt compelled to re-examine every detail from the very beginning. He wanted to understand precisely how the narrative had twisted from a worried family reporting a missing son to a cold-blooded murder investigation. He took his team back to the sprawling farmhouse one more time for a more forensic sweep. The place felt eerily silent. The white paint, starting to peel under the harsh Queensland sun, still gave the house an air of prosperity, a typical homestead for a successful farmer. But to Jack's trained eye, every corner held the potential for a hidden clue. As soon as he stepped into the living room, that same unsettling feeling returned. The polished floors were spotless, the dining table perfectly set. There wasn't a dirty plate in the sink, or a speck of dust on the cabinets. Jack walked into Liam's room. The door swung open to release a sterile scent of camphor. The wardrobe was filled with clothes folded with military precision. His work boots were lined up, as if they were on display in a shop. On his desk, a few textbooks on aquaculture were stacked in a neat, straight pile. Jack picked one up, flicked through its pages, then placed it back exactly where he found it. He sighed. A young man storming out after an argument doesn't leave his room looking like this. Someone had cleaned up after he was gone. In the ashtray near the bed, he again saw the half-smoked cigarette. Liam was known to be a chain smoker. Jack stared at it for a long moment. If Liam had left in a huff, why would he abandon a freshly lit cigarette? It just didn't add up. He turned to Chloe, who was standing in the doorway, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. Jack asked gently if she had tidied the room since Liam left. She shook her head frantically. "No," she whispered. "I couldn't bring myself to touch his things. I was hoping he'd come back and find everything just as he left it." The words were designed to evoke pity, and for some of the younger officers, they did. But for Jack, the answer was too polished, too neat, just like the room itself. Outside, the farmhands, Kev and Damo, were called over again. They approached with anxious faces, still sticking to the original story that Liam had simply left. But this time, Jack held their gaze a little longer, an unspoken pressure that made both men look away, their fear palpable. Then it was Old Man Finn's turn. The old worker approached respectfully, head bowed. Jack led him to a spot under a large gum tree near the boundary fence, far from prying ears. The faint sound of waves breaking on a distant beach could just be heard. Jack's question was simple. "Did you see anything unusual in the days leading up to this?" Finn remained silent for a long time, his gnarled fingers nervously twisting the brim of his faded hat. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "A few nights the water in Pond 5 started to smell foul. The prawns were coming to the surface for air. And I saw her, Mrs. Miller, standing by that pond late one night, all alone." Jack looked at Finn, his expression unreadable. He knew the old man was telling the truth. He placed a reassuring hand on Finn's shoulder. "Thanks, mate. Don't mention this to anyone else." As evening approached, Jack did one last circuit of the property. He paused at the large storage shed on the western side. The wooden door was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw stacks of feed sacks, coils of thick nylon rope, and a small wheelbarrow with iron wheels caked in mud. He crouched down, touched the dried mud on the tires, and made a quick note in his pocketbook. Before leaving, he stood in the yard and looked back at the grand house. It looked imposing, but inside, it was rotting with secrets. Every window was shut tight, every door locked, as if refusing to let the light in. That night, back at the station, Jack briefed his entire team. Spread across the conference table were photos of the house, the bedroom, the shed, and his own observations. He spoke with a quiet, but firm authority. "It's all too neat. No angry young man leaves a room like that. No truly grieving daughter-in-law gives answers that sound like they've been rehearsed. And no father stays that calm looking at his own son's corpse." The room was silent. A few of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them murmured, "So, from the very beginning, we've been watching a play." Jack nodded grimly. "Exactly. And now, it's our job to pull back the curtain, one lie at a time." The following day, the town was buzzing. Locals gathered in front of the farm, just to stare at the police tape that still cordoned off the property. Whispers circulated. Some couldn't believe it. Others claimed they'd always felt there was something strange about the big house. A woman who ran a fish and chip shop down by the marina commented grimly, "Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't cover up the smell of a secret buried in mud." Chloe became more reclusive, rarely leaving her room. She grew thin, her gaze vacant. Bruce, on the other hand, tried to maintain an air of normalcy, ordering the workers about their daily tasks. But people started keeping their distance. They could sense a storm was brewing. That night, Jack Riley wrote a final entry in his notebook for the day: "House too clean, room too tidy, answers too perfect." The tidier it is, the more obvious it becomes that something is being hidden. The investigation's direction was now crystal clear. They were no longer searching for a missing person, they were searching for the truth buried beneath a carefully constructed facade of cleanliness. In the small conference room at the Mackay police station, the air was thick and still. The only light came from a flickering fluorescent tube overhead, casting long shadows across the table littered with files, maps of the farm, and freshly printed crime scene photos. Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley sat at the head of the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression grim. Several younger detectives waited, some fidgeting restlessly, others scribbling in their notepads. Jack opened the initial missing persons report, filed on the morning of June 3rd. He read it aloud, his voice low and steady, dissecting each sentence. Liam was last seen on the evening of June 1st. The family reported him missing on the morning of June 3rd. That's a 2-day gap. He closed the file with a soft thud and looked up at his team. To a civilian, that might not seem like much. But to us, it's a red flag the size of Queensland. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces in the room. If they were genuinely worried, why would they wait that long? The excuse they gave, that they thought he'd just gone off in a huff, doesn't wash. A normal father, a normal wife, would be frantic after 24 hours, let alone 48. A young detective raised his hand. Maybe they were just hoping he'd come back on his own, sir. Jack shook his head slowly. That's the obvious answer. The answer that sounds reasonable. But it's too reasonable. My experience tells me that when a report is delayed, it's often to give the perpetrators time to destroy evidence and get their story straight. He tapped a photo of Liam's immaculate bedroom. Look at the state of this room. Look at Chloe's flawless, rehearsed answers. This was a script. And that 2-day delay was their rehearsal time. He then pointed to another photo, this one of the wheelbarrow tracks leading from the shed. That's not a coincidence. Someone moved something heavy from that shed to the pond. The room fell silent, the only sound the weary hum of the old ceiling fan. It dawned on everyone that this was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was a premeditated murder. Meanwhile, in the town, the gossip was running rampant. At the local pub, fishermen and farmers debated the case over beers. Some said Liam was always a bit of a dreamer, not cut from the same tough cloth as his old man. Others whispered that they'd seen Chloe looking unhappy for months, often seen walking alone along the beach at dusk. The stories swirled, a mixture of fact, fiction, and small-town speculation. But they all circled back to the same question: why did they wait 2 days to call the cops? That night, Jack went home to his small, government-issued house. He sat on his back deck with a beer, staring out at the dark ocean. The sound of the waves and the salty air usually calmed him, but tonight they offered no comfort. He remembered seeing a wedding photo of Liam and Chloe on the wall of the farmhouse. They looked so young, so full of hope. His heart ached for the young man. He muttered into the darkness, "Why did you have to die at the hands of the people who were supposed to protect you?" He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "The 2-day gap was for constructing a narrative, not for searching. It's the clearest sign of fabrication." He knew the road ahead would be tough. Confronting strangers was one thing, but breaking down the walls of a family, especially one as powerful and respected as the Millers, required a different kind of strategy. The next day, he gathered his team again. He ordered a deep dive into the phone records, not just Liam's, but Chloe's and Bruce's as well. Every call, every text, would be cross-referenced. From that data, he explained, we'll see who was talking to who, and when. If Chloe really did lie about that phone call from Liam, it will be the first crack in the wall they've built. On the farm, Bruce was starting to feel the pressure. He heard from the workers that the police were asking probing questions. He tried to brush it off as standard procedure, but a quiet unease was beginning to gnaw at him. He spent more and more time alone on the veranda of the big house, staring out at the now empty pond, as if searching for an answer in the mud. Chloe, too, was changing. She barely spoke. She was often seen sitting by her bedroom window, staring blankly, twisting the wedding ring that used to belong on Liam's finger. Tears would fall silently down her cheeks, but whether they were for her lost husband or her own guilty conscience was impossible to say. Jack knew one thing for sure, you couldn't force the truth out. You had to apply pressure, patiently, relentlessly, like water dripping on a stone. Eventually, a crack would appear. And that crack would be his way in. He closed the meeting with a final, determined statement. Don't forget, this whole thing started with a 2-day delay. That's where the lies began, and that's where we'll start tearing their story down. On the morning of June 5th, the atmosphere in the Mackay police station felt heavier than usual. A new file was placed on Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley's desk by a young constable. It was the official report from the telecommunications company. Jack opened it, his eyes scanning the columns of data, the lists of incoming and outgoing calls. He stopped at the section that should have shown a call from Liam's phone to Chloe's on the night he disappeared. The space was blank. There was nothing. Not a single call. Jack leaned back in his chair, taking a long, slow breath. He closed the file. He wasn't surprised, but the confirmation sent a cold certainty through him. It was what he had suspected from the very beginning. Chloe had lied. The phone call never happened. He called a few of his team members in for a quick briefing. On a whiteboard, he wrote in large letters, the first lie. When someone is willing to lie from the outset, he explained, his voice low and serious, it means there's something much bigger they are trying to hide. He then gave his instructions. Get Chloe in for a formal interview. I don't want a hard-pressure interrogation. I want a soft approach. Make her feel comfortable, like we are on her side. Then, we slowly introduce the facts. That afternoon, Chloe was brought into an interview room. It was a simple, sterile space with a wooden table and 2 chairs. A small, discreet camera was mounted in the corner. Jack sat opposite her. He didn't start with questions. He simply offered her a glass of water. Chloe looked nervous, her hands trembling as she took the glass. Jack began, his voice calm and empathetic. Chloe, I know this is incredibly difficult for you. Losing a husband is a terrible thing. I want to help you, but there's one thing that's been bothering me. It's about that phone call from Liam. He looked at her, his expression conveying nothing but a desire to understand. Chloe hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. She looked down at the table and whispered, yes. Liam called me. Just for a minute. Jack didn't challenge her directly. He simply nodded, then opened the file and slid the printout of the phone records across the table. This is the official log from the phone company, Chloe. There were no calls from Liam's number to yours at the time you mentioned. Chloe looked up, her face draining of all color. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Jack continued gently, if you lied, Chloe, there must have been a reason. I just want to understand that reason. Tears began to stream down Chloe's face. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice choked. I was just scared. I was scared that if I said I hadn't heard from him at all, you'd all think the worst. I just wanted there to be some hope. Jack watched her in silence. He knew it wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the fear of being caught. He made a mental note, the first lie is exposed. Now, we wait for the rest. Later, Bruce was also brought in for a brief questioning. He walked in with a confident stride, his face an unreadable mask. When asked why he waited 2 days to file a report, he answered curtly, I thought my son was just angry. I figured he'd come home when he cooled off. The answer was plausible, but Jack saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a coldness that a genuinely worried father wouldn't possess. That evening, Jack briefed his team again. The lies started on day 1. Chloe admitted she wasn't called. That means they concocted a story together. We just need to be patient and wait for the next crack to appear. Outside the station, the town was simmering with gossip. Locals started whispering more openly. Some claimed they'd seen Bruce and Chloe together, looking a little too familiar. Others recounted the vicious arguments they'd overheard between Liam and his father in the weeks before he disappeared. Every rumor added fuel to the growing fire of suspicion. That night, in the big house on the farm, Chloe lay in bed, unable to sleep. She kept replaying Jack's face in her mind, his gentle voice, but his piercing, all-knowing eyes. Eyes that seemed to see right through her. She felt the fortress of lies she had helped build begin to crumble. Meanwhile, Bruce sat on the veranda, chain-smoking, staring into the darkness of the prawn ponds. His face was hard as granite, but inside, a quiet panic was starting to set in. In his small home office, Jack wrote a new entry in his casebook, Data doesn't lie. When words contradict facts, the truth is beginning to show its face. He knew that with each passing day, the psychological pressure would mount. Sooner or later, one of them would break. And when they did, the entire charade would come crashing down. The next day, Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley returned to the Miller homestead, this time with a full forensic team, to conduct a more thorough examination of every corner. The early morning sun reflected off the white walls of the house, making it seem to glow from a distance. But to Jack, that glow was merely a facade, a thin veil hiding the darkness within. They entered Liam's bedroom. The air was cool, a mixture of camphor and old timber. The sound of the officer's boots echoed on the polished floorboards. Jack stood in the middle of the room, his eyes methodically scanning every detail. The wardrobe was filled with perfectly folded clothes, as if arranged by a meticulous hand. The rack of work boots was neatly aligned, not a single pair out of place. On a small table, an alarm clock still ticked away, as if waiting for its owner to return. He walked over to the bed. The bedspread was smooth, without a single wrinkle. The pillows were arranged symmetrically. There were no signs of someone leaving in a hurry. He imagined a furious young man storming out of the house. There would surely be clothes strewn about, a drawer left open, or a missing pair of boots. But here, everything was perfect. Too perfect. The ashtray was still on the bedside table. Jack bent down and carefully picked up the half-smoked cigarette. The ash was still intact, as if it had been extinguished just moments before. He stared at it for a long time. If Liam had truly left that night, why would he abandon a cigarette he had just lit? A smoker, especially an agitated one, would have finished it. He called Chloe over. She was hovering by the door, her voice small and fragile, her eyes downcast. Chloe, since Liam left, Have you been in this room to tidy up? She shook her head quickly. No, sir. I couldn't bear it. I wanted everything to stay just as he left it, for when he came back. Jack just nodded. He knew the answer sounded beautiful, even touching to a civilian. But that's precisely what made him suspicious. He thought to himself, the smoother the answer, the more likely it's fabricated. The forensic team got to work, photographing every angle, taking dust samples, and logging the position of every item. One of the officers whispered to him, "Sir, this room looks like a museum exhibit, not a place someone actually lived in." Jack nodded slowly. That was the exact same feeling he had. After leaving the bedroom, they moved to the main living area. A family portrait hung on the wall. It was a wedding photo of Liam and Chloe. Their faces were full of hope and happiness. Jack paused for a moment, staring at the photo. He wondered to himself, how could two people, who looked so happy on that day, now be separated by such a cruel and violent death? That afternoon, Jack returned to the station, his mind racing. He opened his notebook and wrote a few key phrases. Room too tidy. Cigarette, but suggests he never left. Chloe denies cleaning, but her answer is too perfect. This is all a performance. That night, he sat on the veranda of his house, watching the distant lights of the fishing boats on the horizon. He remembered his own childhood in a small coastal town, where people were simple, honest, and straightforward. It was a stark contrast to what he was witnessing now. A grand house hiding a rotten core of deceit. Back at the farm, Chloe sat alone on her bed. Her vacant eyes were fixed on the wedding ring on her finger. Suddenly, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. But it was impossible to know who the tears were for Liam, who was gone forever, or for herself, trapped in a web of lies that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, Bruce sat on the porch, staring into the darkness of the prawn farm, a cigarette glowing in his hand. The smoke curled up into the night air. He knew the police were closing in, but he was still convinced he could hold out. In his notes, Jack knew that the truth couldn't be hidden forever. Like the foul smell from a muddy pond, a lie will always find a way to surface. And that tidy room was one of the most obvious cracks in their story. The sun was just beginning its descent towards the western horizon when Jack decided to interview all the farmhands one by one. The usually bustling Miller property was eerily quiet. The workers sat anxiously under a large gum tree, waiting to be called. The first one in was Kev, a young man with a sunburnt face and calloused hands, nervously twisting a worn-out cap. Jack asked him gently if he had noticed anything unusual around the time Liam disappeared. Kev looked down, his voice hurried. "Nah, mate. Nothing. Liam just took off. Everyone knows that." Next was Damo, a bit older and more heavily built from years of hauling feed bags. His answer was identical. Liam got angry and left. That's all there is to it. Jack observed them both, his suspicion growing. He knew from experience that when you asked a group of people the same question, you'd get a variety of answers, filled with different details and perspectives. But this time, it was as if all the workers were reading from the same script. It wasn't a coincidence. It meant they had been coached. After questioning nearly all of them, Jack called in the last worker, an old-timer named Finn. His hair was white, his skin a deep, leathery brown from a lifetime under the sun. He walked slowly, with a heavy gait. As soon as he sat down, he looked at the floor, as if afraid to speak. Jack spoke to him with a calm, respectful tone. "Finn, I know you've been working here a long time. I also know you're an honest man. I don't want to cause you any trouble. I just need to know if you saw or felt anything strange over the last few days." Finn clutched his hat tightly. He was silent for a long time, his lips trembling, his eyes fixed on the ground. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "The last few nights. Something's been wrong with Pond 5. The prawns keep coming to the surface. And the water. It smells off, like something's rotting in there." Jack leaned forward, listening intently. Finn continued, "I also saw her. Mrs. Miller. Standing by that pond late at night. She was all alone, just standing there for a long time, then she hurried off." The interview room was silent. Jack's junior officers exchanged glances. This testimony was a crack of light in the darkness. Jack looked at Finn with gratitude. He patted the old man on the shoulder and whispered, "Thanks, Finn. Don't tell anyone about this. Let us handle it." After Finn left, Jack sat in thought. He wrote in his notebook, "Pond 5. Prawns surfacing, water smells foul. Chloe seen there at night." All the clues were pointing to one spot. That afternoon, he walked out to Pond 5. Its surface was calm, reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun like a mirror. A gentle sea breeze created small ripples on the water. But to Jack, that tranquility was a mask, hiding something dark and sinister. He stood at the edge of the pond for a long time, thinking to himself, "This is where the secret is buried." In the village, news began to spread that the police were taking a special interest in Pond 5. Passers-by would slow down, whispering among themselves. Children were warned to stay away. For the locals, that pond was no longer a source of livelihood, it was a place of dark secrets. That evening, Jack gathered his team. He laid out Finn's testimony. They all agreed that Pond 5 needed to be under tight surveillance. Cameras were installed, police tape was reinforced, and all feeding was halted. Jack said, "We'll wait. The perpetrators are bound to get nervous when they see us focusing on the place where they hid their secret." And he was right. That night, the camera captured a figure, Chloe, standing at the edge of the pond. Her face was no longer sad, it was filled with anxiety. Her gaze was restless, her hands wringing the fabric of her dress. It was as if she knew the secret she had buried was about to be unearthed. Jack watched the footage over and over. He closed his eyes for a moment, then let out a long sigh. He knew his next move had to be a bold one. Pond 5 could not be left untouched. The truth was hiding there, waiting to be brought to the surface. That afternoon, the sky over the coastal town was a brilliant, golden orange as Jack's team strung police tape around Pond 5. Locals driving past slowed down, their curiosity piqued. A few mothers whispered to each other, wondering why that particular pond was being closed off. Children were told to keep their distance, their games now confined to yards far from the water's edge. At the side of the pond, Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley supervised his officers. He instructed them to set up surveillance cameras at 3 strategic points, one aimed directly at the pond, another covering the small track leading to the shed, and a final one watching the eastern fence line. Jack knew these cameras weren't just for monitoring prawn activity, they were for observing the movements of the people who still held the key to the secret. Once everything was in place, he stood for a long time, staring at the water's surface. The pond looked peaceful, its ripples catching the last of the afternoon light. But beneath that calm exterior, he sensed something was deeply wrong. The smell of the mud, mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness, pricked at his nostrils. He murmured to himself, "The truth is hiding in there. Just waiting for its moment to surface." Night fell, and the small town sank into darkness, illuminated only by the porch lights of scattered houses. The hum of the farm's pumps ceased, replaced by the symphony of crickets. In a temporary police command post set up in a caravan, Jack and 2 of his officers sat hunched over a small monitor, watching the live feeds from the cameras. The clock showed it was just past 11 p.m. when a shadowy figure appeared on the screen. The person walked slowly, deliberately, towards Pond 5. It was Chloe. She was wearing a simple long dress, her hair unbound. She stopped at the water's edge and stood there for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dark water. The night vision camera clearly captured the look of pure anxiety on her face. Her hands twisted the fabric of her dress, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if sensing she was being watched. Jack leaned closer to the screen, his eyes never leaving the monitor. He could read Chloe's body language perfectly. That wasn't the face of a grieving widow. It was the face of someone guarding a terrible secret. The longer she stood there, the more palpable her fear became. One of the young detectives whispered, "Maybe she's just missing her husband, sir." Jack shook his head slowly. People who are mourning bring flowers or say a prayer. She's not doing that. She's staring at the water with dread, as if she's afraid of what might rise from the mud. After nearly 20 minutes, Chloe turned and walked briskly back towards the house. The camera tracked her every step. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired face. He knew that this footage proved their suspicions were correct. Pond 5 held the secret, and Chloe knew exactly what was buried there. The next morning, the team gathered again. Jack replayed the footage. Everyone watched in silence, their faces grim. When Chloe appeared at the edge of the pond, the room grew still. Jack paused the video on a close-up of Chloe's face, her eyes wide with fear. He said softly, "Look at her eyes. That's not grief. That's terror." Everyone nodded in agreement. A detective commented, "It's as if she's expecting something to climb out of that pond." Jack added, "Or she knows that what's in that pond can't be hidden for much longer." That afternoon, he returned to the location. He stood at the edge of Pond 5, watching the surface reflect the evening sky. A gentle breeze carried the salty smell of the sea mixed with the foul odor from the mud. Jack knew their time was running out. If there was indeed something at the bottom of the pond, the longer they waited, the harder it would be to recover intact. That night, Jack wrote in his casebook, "The camera never lies." Chloe stood at the edge of the pond with a face full of fear. This confirms that Pond 5 is the epicenter of this case. Tomorrow, we make a decision. In the main farmhouse, Chloe couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed, her eyes red and swollen, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the constant surveillance, even though she didn't know exactly where the cameras were. Every shadow at the window made her jump. She was beginning to realize that the fortress of lies she had built with her father-in-law was about to collapse. In the living room, Bruce watched Chloe from a distance. He knew his daughter-in-law was starting to crack. His face remained a hard mask, but his mind was racing. He knew that the more the police pressed, the more likely it was that Chloe would break. He gripped his cigarette tightly, the smoke curling up towards the ceiling. Meanwhile, in the police post, Jack stared at a map of the farm, with a large red circle around Pond 5. He murmured to himself, "The truth is buried there. And tomorrow, the water has to come down, the mud has to be opened up, and all these lies have to be exposed." June 6, 2018, before dawn. The coastal farms were still shrouded in a thin morning mist. The first rooster had just crowed, and the distant chug of fishing boats could be heard from the sea. But at the Miller farm, the atmosphere was tense. A large industrial pump had been brought in overnight, and at precisely 5 a.m., its deafening roar shattered the morning silence. The water in Pond 5 began to be slowly siphoned out. At first, the surface just rippled, but as the hours passed, the water level dropped, revealing the thick, black sludge beneath. A foul, acrid smell spread through the air, causing some of the locals who had gathered to watch from a distance to cover their noses. Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley stood with his team at the edge of the pond, his eyes fixed on the receding water. Every minute felt like an hour. He knew that beneath that mud, the truth was waiting. His heart pounded, but his face remained a mask of calm professionalism. By 10:30 a.m., the water was at half level. Large prawns flapped desperately in the shallows, some already dead, others still struggling in the remaining water. The technicians worked tirelessly to keep the pump running. The crowd of onlookers grew, held back by a police line. At 3 pp., one of the technicians suddenly yelled, "Sir! There's something in the western corner of the pond." All eyes turned in that direction. Jack immediately signaled for the forensic team to go in. Wearing high rubber boots, they carefully waded into the thick mud. The stench was now overwhelming, mixed with something sharper, more nauseating. From the sludge, a large, dark object slowly emerged. It was round and indistinct. The officers used shovels to clear the mud, and little by little, something tied with rope began to appear. The horrific smell of decay intensified, causing one of the young detectives to vomit at the edge of the pond. When the water was completely drained, everyone froze. It was a human body. It was tightly bound to a large rock with nylon rope. The flesh was decomposed, the face disfigured beyond recognition. But the clothes were still faintly visible, a dark green work shirt with a white stripe on the sleeve. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, then took a deep breath. He gave a brief order, "Lift it slowly. Don't lose any evidence." The officers worked carefully, securing the body and lifting it onto a tarp. The stench spread, causing some of the onlookers to scream in horror. When the body was finally on solid ground, a heavy silence fell. Only the sound of seagulls circling overhead could be heard. Jack looked down at the remains for a long time. His heart felt heavy, but now everything was clear. Liam had never left. He had been murdered, and his body dumped in the pond to be consumed by the mud and time. Chloe was called to identify the remains. The moment she saw the clothes and the ring on the finger, she let out a piercing scream and collapsed to the ground, sobbing hysterically. Some of the local women rushed to her side. But Jack just watched, his expression unreadable. To him, her cry sounded more like fear than grief. Bruce walked slowly towards the body. He looked at it for a moment, then said flatly, "Yeah, that's Liam." There were no tears, no cries of anguish, just a single, cold statement. Jack observed his reaction carefully. He thought to himself, a real father wouldn't be this calm seeing his son's body. The forensic team immediately began their work, photographing, taking samples, and documenting every detail. The initial examination revealed that Liam had not drowned. There was a massive wound at the back of his head, indicating he had been struck with a blunt object. Only after he was unconscious was his body tied up and thrown into the pond. Jack stood tall, his eyes fixed on the large farmhouse in the distance. He knew that house held the key to all the answers. The nights that were too quiet, the room that was too tidy, the answers that were too smooth, it all finally made sense. That evening, the news of the discovery of Liam's body spread throughout the town. People gathered on the streets, speaking in low tones. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Children asked their parents, "Why was there a body in the pond?" The parents could only shake their heads, unable to explain the depths of human cruelty. That night, Jack sat in the command post. In front of him was a map of the farm with a large red circle around Pond 5. He wrote in his notebook, "The truth has emerged from the mud. Liam's body is the strongest evidence that everything we suspected is true. Now, it's time to find out who put him there." The air in the forensic lab at the Mackay Base Hospital was thick with the sharp smell of antiseptic. Bright fluorescent lights glared down on the cold steel tables. Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley stood in the corner with two junior detectives, his face tense, his eyes focused on the work of the forensic pathologist. The pathologist, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, presented his initial findings. In a calm, measured voice, he explained that Liam's lungs were not filled with water. This meant he had not drowned. Instead, there was a massive fracture at the back of his skull, consistent with a powerful blow from a blunt object. The injury was severe enough to have caused immediate unconsciousness. Only after that was his body bound with nylon rope, weighed down with a rock, and thrown into the pond. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, a knot tightening in his stomach. He pictured Liam's final moments, a young man, perhaps turning to speak to someone he trusted, only to be struck down from behind, falling without a chance to fight back. His body then treated like garbage, thrown into the dark mud to be forgotten. He looked at the remains on the steel table and whispered to himself, "Liam, I promise your truth will not be buried with you." That night, Jack gathered his team at the station. The mood in the briefing room was somber. On a whiteboard, Jack wrote 3 key points: wound to the head, not drowned, bound with a rock. He looked at each of his officers and said, "This wasn't an accident. This was a premeditated murder." A young detective raised his hand. "If he was hit from behind, it means he didn't see it coming." Jack nodded. "That's right. It means the killer was someone he knew, someone he trusted. He wasn't expecting any danger." The discussion continued late into the night. All the evidence pointed to someone within the family. Only they could have gotten close to Liam without raising suspicion. Only they had the time to construct a cover story. And only they had the authority to keep the farmhands silent. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Chloe couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed, her face pale, her eyes vacant. She remembered the night Liam was called out of the house. He had left with a small smile, believing the invitation was sincere. But minutes later, everything had turned into a nightmare. The memory haunted her, making her body tremble. Bruce sat on the porch, staring at the pond, now cordoned off with police tape. The cigarette in his hand had burned down to the filter, but he hadn't moved. He knew the police were getting closer to the truth, but his heart was still hardened. He believed that if he remained calm, they would never be able to prove anything. The next day, Jack re-interviewed some of the witnesses. He showed a photo of the head wound to the farmhands and asked, "Did you hear any loud noises that night?" Most of them just shook their heads, but Damo hesitated. Finally, in a low voice, he admitted to hearing a loud thud from the direction of the shed around midnight, but he had been too scared to investigate. This testimony strengthened Jack's suspicions. The shed, the nylon rope, the wheelbarrow, and Pond 5, they were all connected, telling a single, horrifying story. Jack felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. That night, he wrote a new entry in his notebook: Liam was struck, not drowned. A blow from behind signifies betrayal. The killer didn't have the courage to face him. This is a crime born of fear and hatred. In the town, the news of the head wound spread quickly. People were shocked. Some whispered that the killer must have been someone close to him. An old woman at the fish market said softly, "It's better to lose your wealth than to lose your soul." Her words made many people nod in silent agreement. Jack knew the path to the truth was still long. But with the forensic results, he now had a solid foundation. It was no longer a suspicion, it was scientific proof that Liam had been murdered. All that was left was to find out who was holding the weapon on that dark night. The morning after the forensic results were confirmed, Jack decided to return to the crime scene. He felt that the evidence of the head wound and the bound body wasn't enough. Every inch of soil around Pond 5 had to be re-examined. The sun was just rising as the investigation team descended on the edge of the pond. The mud was still damp, revealing strange tracks and furrows. Jack walked slowly, his eyes scanning every detail. He crouched down, touching the ground with his fingertips. There was a long, straight groove, as if something heavy had been dragged from the shed towards the water. He signaled to a young detective. "Measure the width of this groove." The detective placed a metal ruler across it. The width matched that of the small wheelbarrow in the shed. Jack nodded slowly, his mind connecting the dots. A wheelbarrow, dragged in the dead of night, carrying a heavy burden towards the silent pond. A few meters from the groove, two distinct sets of footprints were visible. One was large and deep, leaving the impression of a work boot. The other was smaller, lighter, like the print of a sandal or a woman's shoe. The tracks ran parallel, sometimes overlapping, indicating that two people had walked together. Jack stood for a long time, staring at the footprints. His heart felt heavy, but his mind was clearer than ever. Two people had worked together that night. One, strong enough to push a heavy wheelbarrow. The other, smaller, perhaps assisting, perhaps just accompanying, but definitely present. He took a deep breath and said to his team, "Document everything. Photograph it from every angle. Don't miss a single detail." That afternoon, back at the station, the crime scene photos were pinned to a large board. All the detectives gathered around, their faces serious. Jack pointed to the photo of the wheelbarrow track. "This leads from the shed to the pond." Then he pointed to the photo of the footprints. Two people. One large, one small. The room was silent. Everyone knew who he was referring to. One large, Bruce. One small, Chloe. Their names were unspoken, but they filled the air. Jack looked at his team, his voice low but firm. "This means what we suspected is true. They weren't just covering up a crime, they were directly involved." Meanwhile, in the big house, Chloe sat in her room, her eyes vacant, staring at the wall. She felt trapped. Every time she heard a police car drive by, her heart pounded. She knew they had found something. The memory of that night, standing at the edge of the pond with her father-in-law, haunted her. Bruce tried to remain calm. He still gave orders to the workers, but everyone knew something had changed. The townspeople began to keep their distance. There were no more friendly smiles, only suspicious glances from afar. That evening, Jack sat alone on the veranda of the police station. The afternoon breeze carried the smell of mud and salt. He watched the sky slowly turn orange. He thought to himself, "Liam, now we know who put your body at the bottom of that pond. It's just a matter of time until they confess." That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Wheelbarrow track. Two sets of footprints. This is the clearest proof that this murder was not a solo act. There was cooperation, a plan, and a betrayal committed by those closest to him." In the town, the news of the footprints began to spread. The locals whispered that the police had found strong evidence. Some were shocked, others nodded slowly, as if they had suspected it all along. An old man at the pub said softly, "A big tree doesn't fall because of a storm, but because of the termites within." His words made everyone in the room fall silent, contemplating their meaning. Jack knew that the evidence in the ground couldn't speak in words, but the lines of the tracks and the imprints of the feet had told a more honest story than any human mouth. Now, it was time for the next step, to break the wall of silence between Bruce and Chloe. That day, Liam's body, now cleaned of the mud and grime, lay in the identification room of the local hospital. The stark white light of the fluorescent lamps made the room feel even colder. Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley stood beside the steel table, waiting for the family to arrive for the formal identification. Chloe entered first. As soon as the white sheet was pulled back, revealing Liam's disfigured face, she let out a piercing scream. Her body trembled, her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs echoing through the room. A couple of nurses rushed to help her to a chair. Her crying didn't stop, it escalated into hysterical shrieks. The people in the room felt a wave of pity. But Jack remained standing, his eyes observing every detail. Chloe's cries sounded more like terror than grief. He saw how her shoulders shook, not just from sadness, but from a deep-seated anxiety. The secret she was hiding was beginning to unravel. A few minutes later, Bruce walked in. The old man moved slowly, his hand still holding a cigarette he had extinguished outside the door. He stood by the table, looked down at his son's body for a moment, and then, in a flat voice, said, "Yeah, that's Liam." That was all. There were no tears, no cries of anguish. Jack watched him closely. A normal father, seeing his son's body in such a horrific state, would have broken down, or at least shown some emotion, trembling, crying, anger. But Bruce was a statue of ice. His face was rigid, his eyes cold, as if he felt nothing. After the identification was complete, Chloe was led out, still sobbing. Bruce walked out calmly, giving a slight nod to the officers, and left without another word. The contrast between the two was stark. That night, Jack sat in his office, writing a new note. Chloe hysterical, Bruce too calm. One shows fear, the other absolute control. Neither is a normal reaction. They share a secret, but they are handling it differently. In the town, the news of their different reactions quickly spread. The people who had initially felt sorry for Chloe began to wonder, were her tears genuine, or just an act? Meanwhile, Bruce's cold demeanor convinced the locals that he was hiding something. The next morning, Jack gathered his senior detectives. He replayed the footage of Chloe standing by the pond at night. Then he showed them the photo of the footprints at the water's edge. Finally, he reminded them of Bruce's reaction in the identification room. In a calm voice, he said, "We are not just dealing with a murder. We are dealing with two people who are playing a role." A young detective asked, "Is it possible that Chloe is just a victim, trapped in Bruce's game?" Jack shook his head. If she were just a victim, she wouldn't have lied about the phone call. She wouldn't have been standing by the pond in the middle of the night. Her tears are a sign of fear that the secret will be exposed, not of grief for her lost husband. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse, Chloe lay weakly on her bed. Her eyes were swollen, her body trembling. Every time she thought of Liam's body, she broke down in tears. But between the sobs, her mind was filled with anxiety. The police were getting closer, and she knew that sooner or later, everything would be revealed. Bruce still tried to maintain his composure. He sat on the porch, staring at the empty pond. His face was a mask, but his mind was in turmoil. He knew the police wouldn't stop. He knew that one wrong move from him or Chloe could expose everything. Jack devised a new strategy. He decided it was time to separate them. The psychological pressure would be much stronger if they could no longer support each other. He knew that in many cases, when two people share a secret, the weaker one usually breaks first. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Tears can be deceptive, calmness can be deceptive. But when both are part of a performance, sooner or later, the masks will fall. And it's our job to make sure they do." Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley sat in the briefing room, staring at the large board covered in photos and notes. The scattered pieces of evidence were beginning to form a complete, horrifying picture. He closed his eyes and tried to reconstruct the events of that night in early June. The air at the farm was still, filled only with the sound of crickets and the gentle rustle of wind through the mangroves. The sky was dark, with a thin sliver of a moon hanging over the big house. Liam was in his room, staring at a textbook on aquaculture, his mind still reeling from the heated argument with his father. He wanted to prove that new methods could improve the farm, but his father had stubbornly refused. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Her voice was soft, hesitant. She said she wanted to meet him at the old watch post near the shed. She wanted to talk, to apologize. Liam paused. Although he was still angry, he softened. He knew his wife was not one for confrontation. If she was calling him this late, it must be important. Liam left his room, walked through the quiet house, and down the wooden stairs. Chloe was waiting for him outside. Her eyes looked tearful, her face drawn. In a low voice she said, "Liam, let's just talk for a bit. I don't want us to keep fighting." He sighed and nodded. He followed Chloe towards the watch post at the edge of the ponds. The night was silent, save for the croaking of frogs from a nearby creek. Hidden in the shadows of the shed, Bruce stood perfectly still. In his hand, he held a heavy piece of timber. His eyes were sharp, his breathing heavy. He waited, holding himself back, staying calm. This was not a spontaneous decision. He had been planning it. The argument with Liam a few days ago had only fueled the fire in his heart. Liam sat on the wooden bench at the watch post. Chloe sat opposite him, her head bowed, tears rolling down her cheeks. She whispered, "Liam, I'm scared of losing you. I just want us to be okay." Liam's heart melted. He raised his hand to touch her shoulder. At that exact moment, from behind, the heavy piece of timber struck the back of his head with a sickening thud. The sound of wood hitting bone was short and sharp. Liam staggered, his eyes wide with shock, and then collapsed to the ground without a sound. Chloe gasped, covering her mouth, her body shaking. Bruce emerged from the darkness, his face cold and emotionless. He ordered, "Quick, no more crying." They dragged Liam's body to the shed. A large coil of nylon rope was ready. They tied his hands and feet tightly, then placed his body on a small wheelbarrow. They pushed the wheelbarrow slowly along the dirt path towards Pond 5. The wheels creaked, leaving a long groove in the damp earth. Chloe walked beside it, trembling, glancing back at the house as if afraid of being seen. When they reached the edge of the pond, they stopped. A large rock, normally used as a net weight, was waiting. They tied it to Liam's body, wrapping the rope around him multiple times. The night grew even quieter, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. Bruce looked at his son's body for a moment, his face hard, his eyes empty. Then, together with Chloe, he pushed the body into the water. There was a loud splash, and Liam's body sank to the muddy bottom. Silence returned. There were no prayers, no tears, just the gentle lapping of the water, swallowing the secret into the earth. Bruce stood there for a long time, a cigarette lit in his hand, the smoke curling into the night air. He knew his life would never be the same, but his hatred and greed had overshadowed everything else. Chloe stood behind him, her face pale, tears falling silently, her lips sealed. Jack opened his eyes. The reconstruction in his mind felt incredibly real, as if he had been there that night. He knew that the truth could only be proven with evidence and a confession, but that vision was enough for him to understand how it had all happened. That night, he wrote a new note: Liam didn't drown. He was struck from behind. The killer was not a stranger. Only someone close could have lured him out at night. And only his own father could have tied a rock to his body without an ounce of remorse. Jack closed his book and looked up at the night sky. He promised himself that he would not stop until the truth came from the killer's own mouths. On June 7, 2018, the interrogation rooms at the Mackay police station were thick with tension. 2 separate rooms were prepared. One for Chloe, accompanied by a female detective. The other for Bruce, with two senior male detectives. Detective Senior Sergeant Jack Riley monitored both from behind a one-way mirror. Chloe sat hunched in a wooden chair, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She nervously shredded a tissue in her small hands. The female detective opposite her spoke gently, like an older sister offering comfort. "Chloe, we know you're hurting. But all the evidence is pointing in one direction. If you were just caught up in this, now is the time to speak." Chloe kept her head down, refusing to answer. Her eyes were fixed on the table, her lips trembling. Jack entered the room slowly and sat down opposite her. He said in a low voice, "I believe you once loved Liam. But if you continue to stay silent, you will go down for someone else's crime." He opened a file and slid a photo of the small footprints by the pond across the table. "Look at this. The print matches your sandals." Chloe looked up, her eyes widening. Jack continued, "So how can you say you were never near the pond?" Tears streamed down Chloe's cheeks. She whispered, "I only went there once." Jack shook his head slowly. He pulled out another photo, a still from the surveillance camera, showing her standing at the edge of the pond for a long time. He said, "Someone who knows nothing doesn't stand for that long in a place they should be afraid of." Chloe began to tremble uncontrollably. Her lips quivered, and then she whispered, "If I talk, will the sentence be lighter?" Jack looked at her and replied, "If you were coerced, if you are honest, the law can be merciful. But you have to tell us everything, from the very beginning." In the other room, Bruce sat upright, his back straight, his face calm, his eyes sharp. When asked about the head wound, he replied curtly, "I don't know anything about it." When asked about the wheelbarrow and the rope, he said, "That's just farm equipment." But when a detective said, "Chloe is starting to talk. She's saying this was all your idea, that you forced her to go along with it," Bruce's composure shattered. His eyes widened, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He roared, "Liar! She started it. She was the one who pushed me." The room vibrated with the force of his voice. The detectives exchanged glances. Jack, watching from behind the mirror, nodded slowly. This was what he had been waiting for. The explosion of emotion was the first crack in the wall Bruce had built. He entered the room, walked slowly towards Bruce, and stood before him. In a low voice, he asked, "So you admit you were the one who hit Liam that night?" Bruce was silent for a moment. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his temples. Then he said quietly, "He wasn't fit to run the farm. He only knew theories, not hard work. I couldn't let everything I built be destroyed by him." Those words were the confession Jack needed. He knew that a confession wasn't always a direct admission. Sometimes, anger paves the way to the truth. That night, he wrote a new note, "Chloe is crumbling. Bruce has exploded. Two masks have started to crack. One cries out of fear, the other rages out of pride. But they are both guilty." In the town, news of the interrogations spread quickly. People gathered at the pub, discussing how Chloe was likely to confess and how Bruce was losing his temper. An old fisherman said quietly, "You can't keep a secret buried forever. Like a dead fish in the sea, it will eventually float to the surface." Jack knew it was only a matter of time before both of them told the whole story. That night, the interrogation continued until the early hours of the morning. Chloe finally broke down completely. In a hoarse voice, she said, "It all started in April, when Liam went away for a few days for a course. That night, Bruce knocked on my door with a bottle of rum and sweet words. At first, I refused, but then I got trapped." The illicit affair had grown, a toxic mix of fear and ambition. From that affair, the plan to get rid of Liam was born. Chloe's sobs racked her body. She covered her face, her shoulders shaking. I was wrong. I wasn't strong enough to get out of it. But I was also afraid of losing everything. She continued, describing how she had called Liam that night, asking him to come outside under the pretense of wanting to make up. She recounted how Bruce had struck him from behind, and how they had dragged his body to the shed, tied it up, and dumped it in Pond 5. In the other room, when Bruce was told that Chloe had confessed everything, he let out a bitter laugh. He said loudly, "She was the one who seduced me. She was the one who said that if Liam was gone, the farm would be ours." He paused, his face weary, then continued quietly, "Yes, I was the one who hit him. I am his father, but I couldn't stand to see a weak son inherit everything I had built." Jack stood silently between the two rooms. He felt no sense of victory, no relief. His heart was heavy. A family had been destroyed, not by poverty or disaster, but by greed and uncontrollable lust. A few days later, the official announcement was made. Chloe and Bruce Miller were charged with premeditated murder. The town was in an uproar. People flocked to the courthouse when the first hearing was held in September 2018. The courtroom was packed. The judge read the charges in a firm voice. Bruce was named as the mastermind and the primary perpetrator. Chloe was named as an accomplice who had assisted from beginning to end. The prosecutor emphasized that this was not a spontaneous act, but a carefully planned murder. Chloe sat in the defendant's box, her head bowed. She cried, occasionally covering her face, and offered a quiet apology to Liam's extended family, begging for forgiveness. Her lawyer argued that she had been trapped, pressured, and manipulated by her father-in-law. But the prosecutor fiercely rebutted, if she was forced, why did she lie about the phone call? Why was she standing by the pond at night? Why did she help drag her own husband's body? Bruce was different. He sat upright, his face cold, with no tears, no apology. When the judge asked if he had any regrets, he said simply, "I only regret misjudging Liam. I thought he would destroy the farm. But it was I who destroyed my own family." The townspeople listened with mixed emotions. Some were angry, some were sad, and some just shook their heads in disbelief. A woman whispered to her neighbor, "If a father can kill his own son, if a wife can betray her own husband, this world is a dark place." The trial lasted for several weeks. Finally, the verdict was delivered. Bruce Miller was sentenced to death. Chloe Miller was sentenced to life in prison, with a possibility of parole due to her confession and her lesser role in the crime. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. There was no applause, no cheers, only tears and a bitter sense of loss. After the trial, Jack walked out of the courthouse. The afternoon air felt heavy. In his hand was the small notebook that had faithfully recorded every detail of the investigation. He opened it to the last page and wrote, "The truth finally came out, not because of their words, but because of the evidence that could not be hidden." The water, the mud, even the prawns in the pond, all bore silent witness, and showed the way to justice. Pond 5 is now empty. The police tape has been removed, but no one dares to farm prawns there anymore. The locals call it the cursed pond. Every time they pass by, they whisper, "That's where they found Liam's body. That's where a father's greed and a wife's lies drowned a family's love and blood." The big Miller house has been abandoned. The white paint is peeling, and weeds have taken over the yard. There are no more workers, no more sounds of pumps, only a haunting silence. For Jack, the case left a deep scar. He often sits alone on his veranda, looking out at the sea, contemplating how fragile humans are in the face of their desires. Wealth and power can make a father forget his love, can make a wife betray her husband. But from this case, there was also a lesson. The townspeople often say, No matter how well a lie is hidden, its stench will eventually be smelled. Like a dead fish thrown into the sea, it will eventually float to the surface. The same is true for the truth. It will always emerge, even from the deepest, darkest